The blood was the worst part. Lysandra had thought after the fall of Ironwood 7 years ago that she had seen all the shades of red the world had to offer. The bright arterial spray that painted walls during the final assault. The dark pooling sludge that turned the mountain soil to sucking mire. The dried rust-colored flakes that clung to hair and armor like a second terrible skin. She had been wrong. Here in the laundry pits of Cascade Keep carved into the living rock beneath the fortress, she discovered new horrors. Blood mixed with seawater and sand, a gritty saline paste that refused to release its grip on the coarse wool of the soldiers' tunics. It smelled of iron and the deep cold rot of the ocean floor, a scent that burrowed into the back of her throat and nested there like something alive. Her hands were raw chapped by the lye soap and the relentless rasp of the washboard. The skin across her knuckles had split open 3 times this week, alone the cracks weeping clear fluid that stung when she plunged them back into the scalding water. Invisibility was survival. She was Lysa the washerwoman, Lysa the refugee, Lysa with the downcast eyes and the quiet mouth. She was not Lysandra Ashcroft, last of the Ironwood First Guard. That woman was dead, buried under the rubble of her city, with her father and her pride, and the 29 other warriors who had stood the shield wall until the very end. This new Lysa knew only the ache in her back, the burn in her hands, and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach that no amount of watery gruel could fill. She counted each motion to keep herself tethered to the present, to keep the memories at bay. 147 shirts today, 32 pairs of trousers, 18 bloodied cloaks from the battle at dawn. The battle against the reavers of the Broken Isles had been won, or so the shouts from the courtyard above had proclaimed. Victory had a long and bloody tale. A commotion from the upper levels broke through her grim rhythm. Shouts, the clang of a dropped shield, a woman's sharp cry of fear, panic spreading like fire through dry kindling. Lisa kept scrubbing. Panic was for those who had something left to lose. Then she heard the words hollered from the battlements by a guard to another down below, the sound carrying through the stone channels of the keep. The king, he's shifted. A cold silence fell over the laundry pits. The other women froze their knuckles white on their washing boards. Steam rose from the great copper tubs, wreathing them all in ghostly vapor. The beast, one of them whispered, her voice trembling. He has taken the beast form. Lysa's hands stilled in the foul water. King Thaddeus Stormborn the Alpha, king of the Cascade Cliffs. The wolf of the tides, the man whose armies had crushed the Reaver Raiders at dawn. The man whose forces had also years before been the hammer that broke her own people in the border wars. The man who had ordered the siege of Ironwood. She had never seen him, not his man form, and certainly not the monstrous shape his own people spoke of with such mingled terror and awe. He's wounded, the whisper continued, passed from woman to woman. Took a poisoned harpoon to the flank during the battle. He won't let the healers near him. He's gone to the Tide Claw. The Tide Claw. The great cavern beneath the keep where the tide churned and roared, where the sea came in through channels in the rock to create a thundering, echoing space that was said to be the heart of the king's power. In his solitude, he was wounded, alone, rejecting help. The words echoed in a place deep inside that Lysandra thought had died 7 years ago. The part of her that was a warrior, the part that knew the poison of a reaver's blade was not a thing to be left untended. It was a creeping death, a fire in the blood that turned muscle to stone and boiled the mind in its own skull. She had seen it happen, had watched strong men reduced to convulsing wrecks in less than 8 hours, their bodies rigid and their eyes blind with agony. Something moved in her. Not pity, not loyalty, deeper, more primal. A medic's duty, a warrior's understanding. You do not let a good soldier die alone, even if he is your enemy. The thought surfaced unbidden in her father's voice. Commander Marcus Ashcroft had said those words once when Lysandra was 16 and learning the brutal calculus of the battlefield. They had found an enemy scout gut-shot and dying slowly. Her father had knelt beside the man, given him water, held his hand as the light left his eyes. He wore a uniform, her father had said quietly after. He followed orders. He deserves dignity in death. Lysandra lifted her hands from the water, ignoring the stinging pain. She dried them on her apron, her movements suddenly deliberate, precise. The other women stared as she walked to the cistern at the far end of the chamber, drawing a bucket of the cleanest, warmest water they had. She found a stack of linen scraps, cloths meant for bandages that had been deemed too frayed for the healers, but were still clean enough for washing. "What are you doing?" Marta, one of the older women, hissed, grabbing her arm. Her eyes were wide with fear, the whites showing all around. "Girl, stay here. The beast kills anyone who enters the Tide Claw unbidden. It's not a man when it's wounded. It's all fury and pain." Lisa looked at Marta's frightened face, and for the first time in months, her own gaze was direct, steady. The gaze of someone who had held a shield wall against a cavalry charge. "He will die if the poison isn't clean." "That's the healer's work," Marta stated, her voice flat. The healers can't get near him. Simple logic. The logic of the battlefield. If the medic is down, the nearest soldier steps up. If the officer falls, the sergeant takes command. If a man is dying and no one will help him, then someone must. She pulled her arm free and lifted the heavy wooden bucket, the water slosh still warm from the heating fires. Someone has to wash away the blood. Walking out of the laundry pit, she left the stunned silence of the other women behind her. Their whispered prayers and protests faded as she climbed the narrow stone stairs, emerging into the lower halls of the keep. She didn't know what drove her. Maybe it was a death wish. Maybe after everything she had lost, she simply wasn't afraid to die anymore. The worst had already happened. Her city was ash. Her family was gone. Her brothers in arms were buried under tons of stone. What was one more death? Or maybe it was the ghost of the woman she used to be, rising up through the layers of grief and numbness and survival to do her duty one last time. The path to the tide claw was treacherous. A slick, winding staircase carved into the cliff face on the western edge of the keep, exposed to the elements and slippery with constant spray. The air grew cold as she descended, thick with salt and the violence of waves against rock. The roar of the sea became a physical presence, a constant thunder that vibrated in her bones and made her ribcage hum. 247 steps. She counted every one, the number grounding her, keeping her focused on the simple act of not slipping, not falling to her death on the jagged rocks below, where the surf exploded in white fury. The entrance to the cave was a gaping maw of black stone, the rocks around it sharp and menacing. No guard stood watch. They had been ordered away, or they had fled. She was utterly alone. Lisa took a breath, the salt-laced air burning her lungs, and stepped out of the gray afternoon light and into the darkness. The cave was vast. The sound of the sea was deafening here, a chaotic symphony of crashing waves and hissing backwash. Water dripped from the ceiling somewhere high above each drop, echoing in the immense space like the ticking of some vast inhuman clock. The only light came from faint phosphorescent moss clinging to the damp walls, casting a sickly green-blue glow across the churning water and wet rock. And in the center of the cavern, on a high dry ledge of stone that served as a natural dais, lay the beast. He was bigger than any wolf she had ever seen, larger than a pony, as massive as a grizzly bear. His fur was the color of a storm cloud at midnight, a roiling mix of black and deep charcoal gray, tipped with the silver of sea foam. His form was all predator, a magnificent, terrifying sculpture of muscle and bone built for violence and dominance. And he was drenched in blood, his own and that of his enemies. It matted his thick coat in great dark clumps. Sand and seaweed were tangled in the fur of his legs, in underbelly evidence of the beach battle that had raged at dawn. A deep, ragged gash ran along his left flank, easily 8 inches long, oozing a blackish fluid that sizzled faintly where it touched the stone. The Reaver's poison. He was not lying down in defeat. Coiled a spring of lethal tension barely contained, his massive head rested on his paws, but his eyes were wide open. They were the color of molten silver, glowing with a faint internal light in the gloom of the cave. Unblinking, ancient, aware, fixed on her. He did not growl, he did not move. He just watched her, and the sheer weight of his presence was a physical force pressing down on her chest, demanding she flee. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to obey that command, to drop the bucket, to scramble back up those 247 stairs into the daylight and never return. But Lysandra Ashcroft had faced down charging berserkers at the gates of Ironwood. She had held a shield wall against a cavalry charge when she was 19 years old, had felt the impact of horse and rider against her locked shield and held her ground while men twice her size were thrown backward. She had learned early and learned well to master her fear, to wall it off behind a barrier of cold, practical thought. This was not a king. This was not the conqueror of her people. This was a wounded animal backed into a corner, consumed by pain and fury, and the primal need to be left alone to either heal or die in peace. Moving forward with deliberate slowness, her soft-soled shoes silent on wet stone, she kept her gaze downcast, not meeting those eyes, directly focusing instead on the wound that was killing him. She stopped 10 feet away, well outside his immediate reach, but close enough that her intent would be clear. Kneeling, she placed the bucket of warm water carefully on the ground beside her. Her movements were calm, unthreatening, deliberate. She dipped one of the linen cloths into the water, wringing it out so it wouldn't drip and startle him. "I'm not a healer," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear somehow, carrying over the roar of the waves that crashed and hissed in the darkness beyond the ledge. She didn't know if he could understand her, if the man was still present inside the beast, or if there was only animal pain and animal rage looking out from behind that silver gaze. "But I know poison. Reaver poison, hemlock, and silver compound. It has to be cleaned or it will kill you in 6 hours. Maybe less." The beast's head lifted a fraction of an inch. A low rumble started deep in his chest, so deep it was almost below the range of hearing. Not a growl, deeper, more resonant, a vibration that felt like the earth itself groaning beneath her knees. A warning, a promise of violence if she came closer. Lysa held his stare for a heartbeat. Two. She saw pain there, yes. Agony that would have felled a lesser creature. In rage, a furnace of it burning hot enough to incinerate anything that came within reach. But underneath it, she saw something else. Something that made her heart clench despite herself. A profound, soul-deep exhaustion. A weariness that went beyond the battle, beyond the wound. The look of someone who had carried a burden for so long that the weight had become part of them, inseparable from muscle and bone. She recognized it. She saw it in her own reflection every time she caught her image in still water. Holding up the damp cloth so he could see it clearly, she spoke softly. The blood. Let me help you with the blood. Another slow step forward, and another, each movement telegraphed, each step measured. She was inside his striking range now. One lunge, one snap of those massive jaws lined with teeth as long as her fingers, and it would be over. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, but her hands were steady. Her face was calm. She reached the edge of the stone dais. The beast was a living wall of dark fur and simmering, barely leashed power in front of her. The heat rolling off his body was immense, radiating outward like a furnace. She could smell the blood, the salt, the wet fur, and something else beneath it all, something uniquely him. The scent of winter storms and ancient stone and deep forests where sunlight never reached. Slowly, so slowly, her muscles screamed with the strain of controlled movement. She reached out her hand. She didn't touch the wound. Not yet. That would be too much too soon, a violation that would shatter this fragile moment. Instead, she laid her hand the one holding the damp cloth on his massive shoulder. Far from the injury, a place that would hurt less, a gesture of intent, not intrusion. The beast went rigid. Every muscle in his enormous body locked like iron bars slamming into place. The rumbling in his chest intensified, shaking the very rock beneath her knees, rattling her teeth in her skull. His gaze blazed with an internal fire that had nothing to do with the dim phosphorescent glow of the cave. She felt the power coiled there, the raw strength that could shatter her bones like kindling, tear her limb from limb before she could even scream. She did not pull back. She did not flinch. Holding her ground, her hand gentle but firm on his shoulder, her touch steady despite the trembling that wanted to take over her entire body. She met his stare and poured every ounce of calm she possessed into her own expression, into the set of her shoulders, into the soft, even rhythm of her breathing. I am not a threat. I am here to help. Let me help you. The seconds stretched, her hand on his shoulder, his attention locked on hers. The cave filled with the sound of waves and the thunder of his warning rumble, and her own heartbeat so loud in her ears it was a drum calling her to battle or to funeral, she couldn't tell which. And then the impossible happened. The tension in the beast's body eased. Just a fraction. Just enough. The great shaggy head lowered once more, settling back onto his paws with a heaviness that spoke of surrender, of exhaustion too great to fight anymore. The rumbling subsided, though it did not vanish entirely. It became a constant, low vibration, a warning that he was allowing this, but the allowance could be revoked in an instant. It was a concession, a granting of permission. Lisa's breath escaped her in a shaky sigh she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hand trembled slightly, where it rested on his shoulder. She took another breath, slow and deliberate, centering herself the way her weapons master had taught her years ago. And then she began to work, starting with his shoulder, wiping away the crusted blood and with gentle circular motions. The fur was thick, coarser than she had expected, the outer guard hairs stiff with dried gore. But underneath, closer to the skin, it was surprisingly soft, dense, and warm. She rinsed the cloth, watching the water in the bucket immediately turn a murky pink, and went back to her task. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. The world narrowed to the feel of the warm cloth in her hand, the texture of his fur, the slow, methodical process of cleaning away the evidence of violence. She was a warrior cleaning her armor after a fight. She was a mother cleaning a scraped knee. The actions were familiar grounding, pulling her out of the fear and into the simplicity of motion and purpose. Moving methodically down his back, cleaning away the reaver's blood, dark and thick, and smelling of something caustic and wrong. Then his own blood, brighter red, more honest. He remained utterly still beneath her touch, patient in his suffering. Only the faint, constant vibration in his chest told her he was aware of her every movement, tracking her with senses far beyond human comprehension. As she worked, she began to see the true toll the battle had taken. Not just the great gash on his flank, but a dozen other smaller cuts and bruises hidden beneath the blood and matted fur. A tear in his left ear, the edges ragged, a deep claw mark across his muzzle, bruising along his ribs where something heavy had struck him, each one a testament to the ferocity of the fight. each one a victory that had cost him a piece of himself. She lost track of time. There was only the rhythm of her hands, the gradual lightening of the water from pink to red to a deep viscous crimson as she rinsed and re-wet the cloth again and again. The cave around them faded. The sound of the sea became a distant thing. There was only the beast, the blood, the slow work of healing. Finally, she could ignore the main wound no longer. Moving around to his left side, her heart beginning to hammer again. The flesh around the gash was swollen, discolored, an angry purple-black that spoke of the poison's deep hold. The edges of the wound wept that terrible black fluid, and where it touched the stone it hissed and bubbled like acid. "This will hurt," she murmured, more to herself than to him, a warning she was giving her own hands to be steady, to be gentle, even when gentleness would not spare him pain. She dipped a fresh cloth in the water, wrung it out. This time when she reached for him, a growl ripped from his throat, low and sharp and full of warning. His lips pulled back from his teeth, and they were as long as her fingers, curved and white and built for killing. She froze her hand, hovering over the wound. "I know," she whispered. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere that remembered holding her little brother when he had broken his arm falling from a tree, remembered the way he had screamed when the bone setter had to pull the joint back into place. "I know it hurts, but I have to. The poison will kill you if I don't." She didn't back away, holding her position, her hand steady in the air above the source of his agony. She waited. The growl continued, a sawtoothed edge of pain and fury. He was telling her not to touch it, warning her away from the thing that was killing him, because touching it would bring agony beyond bearing. But the pain would kill him, and she suspected, looking into those exhausted eyes, that part of him knew it. Part of him was ready to let it. "I'll take care of the blood," she said, her voice firmer while carrying the ghost of a commander's tone. The voice she had used when she was 18 and newly promoted to the shield wall, when frightened recruits had looked to her for certainty in the chaos of battle. She would not be cowed by a soldier's fear of the healer's knife, even when that soldier was a 1,200-pound apex predator. She pressed the cloth to the edge of the wound. The beast let out a roar that was pure, unadulterated agony. The sound slammed into her like a physical blow, making her ears ring and her bones ache and her vision blur at the edges. The entire cavern seemed to shake with it, bits of stone dust raining down from the ceiling far above. Birds roosting somewhere in the darkness took flight in a panic of wings. But he did not move. He did not attack her. Absorbing the pain, his body trembling violently, every muscle standing out in stark relief beneath his fur. A storm was breaking within him, a hurricane of suffering, and he held himself perfectly still. Through all of it, he was letting her do this. He was trusting her. Tears pricked at Lisa's eyes, hot and sharp. Not from fear, but from something else entirely. A strange, painful empathy for this creature, this king, this enemy. She saw past the beast to the man inside, a man willing to endure the unendurable for the sake of a stranger's help. Gently, with hands that shook now but did not falter, she began to clean the wound. The poison had burned deep into the tissue. The flesh was hot to the touch, unnaturally so fever-warm and tight with infection. She cleaned away the black ooze, the clotted blood, the filth of sand and seawater that had been driven into the gash. The true extent of the damage revealed itself inch by terrible inch. The harpoon's barb had torn him wide open, ripping through muscle down nearly to the bone. She worked for what felt like an eternity. 47 minutes by her count, measured by the steady drip of water from a stalactite somewhere in the darkness. One drop every 4 seconds, a metronome of stone and time. She rinsed the cloth again and again until the water in the bucket was a dark, viscous red that looked more like blood than water. She cleaned not just the wound itself, but the fur all around it, giving the injury room to breathe, clearing away anything that might cause further infection. It was all she could do. She had no salves, no herbs, no needle and thread to close the torn flesh. But she had made it clean. And sometimes on the battlefield, clean was the difference between life and death. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, exhausted. Her arms trembled. Her back ached from the awkward position. But the gash, while still a terrifying sight, was clean. The angry swelling already seemed marginally less pronounced, the flesh around it no longer quite so tight and hot. The beast's breathing was ragged, each inhale shuddering through his massive frame. But the violent trembling had stopped. He lifted his head slowly as if it weighed more than he could bear, and looked at her. The intensity in his gaze had banked, replaced by something softer. Weariness, yes. Pain that would not leave for days yet. But underneath it, a questioning light. An awareness that saw her, truly saw her, not as a threat or a servant or a ghost, but as a person who had done something no one else had been able to do. He blinked once slowly, and then he did something that shattered her composure completely. He stretched out his great head and nudged her hand with his cold, wet nose. It was a gentle gesture, deliberate and careful despite his size. a gesture of thanks, of acknowledgement, the kind of gesture a wolf might give to a trusted packmate. A single tear traced a path through the grime on Lysa's cheek. She didn't sob, she didn't break, but the tear fell hot and unexpected, dropping from her jaw to land on the stone between them. She reached out with a trembling hand and laid it on his broad head between his ears. The fur there was thick and soft, unmarred by blood or injury. She felt the shape of his skull beneath, solid and real and alive. And she felt something else, a warmth that started in her palm and spread up her arm. Not the heat of fever or exertion, but something different, something that tingled and glowed faintly, barely visible in the dim light of the cave. Gold like late afternoon sun through honey. She didn't understand it. She was too exhausted to question, but it faded as quickly as it had come. She stayed there, kneeling in the dark, her hand on the head of a beast that could kill her without effort, while the sea roared its eternal song against the rocks and time became meaningless. She didn't know if it was minutes or hours. She only knew that something had shifted. Something fundamental had changed in the fabric of the world, though she couldn't name what it was. When she finally stood to her knees, cracking in protest, and picked up her bucket of bloody water, she felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. She had entered the tide claw as a ghost, a woman with nothing, going through the motions of survival because she didn't know what else to do. She walked out with a secret, a strange and dangerous connection to the most powerful man in the kingdom. And for the first time in 7 years, she felt like Lysandra Ashcroft again. Not the broken refugee, not the invisible servant, the warrior. The woman who had held the line, the daughter of Commander Marcus Ashcroft, who had taught her that every life had value, even the enemy's. She climbed the 247 stairs back to the world above, and she did not look back. But she carried with her the memory of that gaze in the darkness and the feeling of a cold nose against her palm and the ghost of that strange golden warmth that had flowed from her hand to the beast's wounded body. She didn't know it yet, but that moment in the cave had changed everything. The next day he came for her. Lysa was back in the laundry pits, her brief, terrifying sojourn into the king's world feeling like a fever dream in the harsh light of morning. The other women avoided her eyes, whispering behind their hands. They thought she was mad, or cursed, or worse, marked by the beast in some way that would bring his wrath down upon them all. She scrubbed shirts and tried not to think about what had passed between her and a monster in the dark. Then the shadows fell over the pits. 2 guards clad in the black and silver armor of the king's personal retinue stood at the top of the stairs. Their faces were grim, impassive masks. The laundry women froze. "Lysandra of Ironwood," one of them called out, his voice booming in the enclosed space, echoing off wet stone walls. Lysa's blood turned to ice. Her hands stilled in the wash water. The cloth she'd been scrubbing slipped from her fingers and sank beneath the murky surface. "Lysandra of Ironwood," the guard repeated. "The king requires your presence." He had used her city's name, her real name, not the diminutive she'd hidden behind. He knew who she was. The conqueror had found a survivor of his old war, and now he was here to finish the poem she had escaped 7 years ago. This was it, the reckoning. The bill come due for the audacity of touching the king's beast without permission, for daring to enter the tide claw when all others had been warned away. Marta shot her a look of pure terror, her face white beneath the grime. Lysa dropped the shirt she'd been scrubbing back into the water. She wiped her hands on her apron, her mind a blank slate of numb resignation. She had survived the fall of Ironwood. She had survived 7 years of invisible servitude, of scrubbing blood from wool and eating scraps and sleeping on straw. She had survived so much, only to be undone by an act of battlefield mercy. There was a bitter irony in that. She walked up the stairs. The guards fell into step on either side of her, close enough that she could feel their presence like walls. They didn't touch her, didn't bind her hands, but their nearness was a cage nonetheless. They led her through the keep. 3 courtyards, their stones still wet from the morning rain. 2 spiral towers, the stairs worn smooth by centuries of feet. Hallways hung with ancient tapestries depicting the triumphs of the storm-born line wolves bringing down elk ships, cresting massive waves, warriors standing victorious over fallen foes. Lisa counted guards as they passed. 14. She noted exit points. 3 doors to the outside, 2 windows large enough to climb through if she were desperate. Instinct, the training of her youth, asserting itself. Always know the battlefield. Always have an escape route. Not that it would matter. Where would she run? She was in the heart of enemy territory, hundreds of miles from anything resembling safety. Finally, they stopped before a set of massive oak doors, easily 10 feet tall and reinforced with iron bands. Carved into the wood were wolves and waves, the dual sigils of House Stormborn, rendered in such detail that the wolves seemed to move in the flickering torchlight. One of the guards knocked once, a sharp, authoritative rap of knuckles on ancient wood. "Enter," a voice from within commanded. It was deep resonant, carrying the same rumbling power as the beast's growl. The sound of it vibrated in Lisa's chest, setting up a sympathetic resonance in her bones. The doors swung open. Lisa was pushed gently but firmly inside, and the doors boomed shut behind her, cutting off her retreat, leaving her alone with the king. The room was his private study. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast an ox whole, the flames casting dancing shadows across the walls. Bookshelves lined every available surface from floor to ceiling, crammed with leather-bound volumes, loose scrolls, and what looked like centuries' worth of accumulated knowledge. The smell of old paper and wood smoke, and something else, something wild, filled the space. A massive desk dominated the center, carved from dark wood, that had the look of salvaged pieces of shipwreck fitted together and polished until they gleamed. Charts and maps covered its surface, held down by daggers and stones and a human skull that served as a paperweight. And behind it stood King Thaddeus Stormborn. He was even larger in his human form than she had imagined. Broad-shouldered and powerfully built, he stood easily 6 feet 4 inches, perhaps taller. He wore simple black trousers and a loose-fitting gray tunic that did nothing to hide the cabled muscle of his arms and chest. This was not soft nobility grown fat on tribute and taxes. This was a warrior's body honed by training and battle. His hair was as black as the beast's fur, shot through with the same startling silver at the temples, and it fell unbound to his shoulders. His face was harsh, all sharp angles and uncompromising lines carved by wind and war and hard years. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a pale line through tanned skin. She knew that scar. She had given it to him 7 years ago in the final defense of Ironwood's eastern gate. A desperate strike as his wolf form had leapt the barricade, her sword catching him across the face before he'd batted her aside like a rag doll. It was not a handsome face in the way of courtly lords with their soft features and practiced smiles. It was a predator's face, beautiful in the way that a hunting hawk is beautiful. Dangerous, compelling, impossible to look away from. But his eyes were the same. Molten silver, intelligent and piercing, carrying the weight of the beast and the man both. Fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare, all her carefully constructed walls and defenses turned to vapor under that gaze. He was not looking at a washerwoman. He was looking at her, at Lysandra Ashcroft, and he saw everything. "You cleaned the wound," he said. His voice was softer than she expected, lacking the harsh command of his earlier summons, but it held an absolute authority nonetheless. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed. Lysa swallowed against a throat gone dust dry. "Yes, Your Majesty." Moving from behind the desk with a predator's grace silent despite his size, he stopped a few feet from her. She had to crane her neck to look up at him. He was a mountain, immovable, ancient. "The healer said the poison would have killed me by morning." He continued, his tone almost conversational, as if they were discussing the weather or the state of the harvest. It had gone too deep. Burned into the muscle, started to corrupt the blood. They could not get close enough to treat it. My beast would not allow it. He paused, his attention never leaving her face, searching for something. "But you could." She said nothing. "What was there to say? And I touched your beast when no one else dared. Yes, I cleaned your wound, and for a moment I felt something pass between us that I don't understand." The words died in her throat, unspoken. "My beast," he said, a strange note entering his voice, now something that might have been wonder or confusion or both, "does not suffer the touch of others, especially not when it is wounded and the rage is upon it. It has killed men for less than what you did. 3 years ago, a healer tried to approach when I was injured in a territorial dispute. The beast tore out his throat before I could stop it." He took another step closer. Lysa held her ground through sheer force of will, though every instinct screamed at her to back away, to flee. "I am not a man," she whispered. The words escaped before she could stop them, some part of her needing to explain to justify why she had been allowed to live when others had died. A flicker of something crossed his face. Amusement, perhaps, or interest. "No," he agreed quietly. "You are not." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. His hand was huge, scarred across the knuckles, calloused from sword work and hard labor. He took her hand in his, and his touch was surprisingly gentle, warm, careful, as if he were afraid she might break. Turning her hand over, examining it in the firelight, the raw, reddened skin from the lye soap, the splits across her knuckles. But underneath, visible to someone who knew what to look for, were older calluses. Deeper. The kind that came from gripping a sword hilt for hours every day, from wielding a shield until the leather strap wore grooves into the palm. "You are Lysandra Ashcroft," he said. Not a question, a statement of fact. "Daughter of Commander Marcus Ashcroft of Ironwood. Your father died on the walls during the siege 7 years ago. He held the eastern gate for 37 minutes against impossible odds, buying time for civilians to evacuate through the northern passage. 200 people escaped because of his sacrifice. The words hit her like blows, each one precise, devastating. He knew. He knew everything. I am a washerwoman, she insisted, but her voice trembled, betraying the lie. You are a liar, he said, but there was no heat in it. No accusation, just simple observation, the way one might comment that the sky was blue or that winter was cold. You move like a soldier. Your hands are chapped from lie, yes, but the calluses beneath are from the hilt of a sword, not a washboard. And when you spoke to my beast, you did not plead. You did not beg. You commanded. He knew. He saw right through her pathetic disguise, through 7 years of carefully maintained invisibility. A warrior from a conquered land standing before her conqueror, exposed and defenseless. She braced herself for the blow, for the order of execution, for the end that she had been expecting since the moment the guards had called her name. Instead, he did something that shattered every expectation. He lifted her hand and pressed it gently against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the strong, steady beat of it beneath her palm, a rhythm like distant thunder. The guilt of Ironwood is a wound I have carried for 7 years. He said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear him over the crackle of the fire. I won a war that needed to be won. Your city was supplying raiders who burned villages and took slaves. The siege was necessary, but necessary does not mean righteous. I broke your people. I killed your father and your brothers in arms. I carry that weight every day. His hand covered hers, holding it against his heart. My beast, he continued, carries the scars of every man who died under my command. It carries the blood. It lets no one touch it because it believes it deserves the pain. It deserves the poison and the wounds and the slow rot of guilt. It has lived in that darkness for so long that pain has become its only companion. He looked down at her, and in those eyes she saw a reflection of her own suffering. The same exhaustion, the same soul-deep weariness. Until you. The words hung in the air between them. Lysa felt her breath catch. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain he could feel it through her hand pressed to his chest. Why, he asked, and the word was a raw whisper stripped of all pretense and authority. Just a man asking a question he needed answered. Why weren't you afraid? Lysa looked up at him. At this king, this conqueror, this man who had destroyed everything she loved, and now stood before her, holding her hand to his heart like it was something precious. I saw a creature in pain, she answered. Her voice was barely audible, but in the quiet of the study it was enough. That is all. A soldier who needed help. The rest didn't matter. Something shifted in his expression. The harsh lines softened imperceptibly. His eyes closed for just a moment, as if her words had given him something he'd been searching for. You saw the truth of me then, he said when he opened his eyes again. Not the king, not the alpha, not the conqueror, just the beast wounded and alone. He released her hand and she felt an odd sense of loss at the absence of his touch. You will no longer work in the laundry, he said, his voice regaining some of its command but gentler now, almost uncertain. Your skills are wasted there. He gestured to a small door near the fireplace, one she hadn't noticed before in her fear and confusion. Those will be your chambers. Small, but private, warm, safe. You will attend me. You will... He paused, seeming to search for words, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in him. Vulnerability. You will be near. It was an order cloaked in a request, clumsy and almost boyish in its delivery. He wanted her close, needed it perhaps in a way he didn't fully understand himself. But even as relief and confusion and a strange warmth bloomed in her chest, she saw movement in the shadowed archway of a connecting room. A woman stood there, tall and elegant, wrapped in a gown of midnight blue silk that whispered with every small movement. Her hair was the color of polished jet falling in perfect waves to her waist. Her face was beautiful in a cold classical way, all high cheekbones and full lips and flawless pale skin. But her eyes were chips of obsidian, black and hard, and absolutely devoid of warmth, fixed on Lysa with a hatred so pure and vicious it was almost palpable. Lady Seraphine Thornville, daughter of Alpha Marcus Thornville of the Eastern Ridge Pact, the woman widely assumed to be the future queen. And she was looking at Lysandra as if she were something foul that had crawled out from beneath a rock. In that moment, Lysa understood with perfect clarity. The king had given her a place by his side. He had seen her, truly seen her, and offered her safety and purpose in the thing she had thought lost forever recognition of who she truly was. But in doing so, he had painted a target on her back. She had survived a war. She had survived a monster in a dark cave. But surviving the cold, calculated hatred of Lady Seraphine Thornville and the politics of this coastal court might prove to be the hardest battle of all. The days that followed were a suspended reality, a dream that Lysandra kept expecting to shatter. Her new chamber was small, barely 12 feet by 14, but to someone who had spent 7 years sleeping on a straw pallet in a dormitory crowded with 20 other women, it was a palace. A narrow bed with actual linens clean and worn soft with age. A small fireplace that she was allowed to tend herself. A window that looked out over the churning, gray-green sea where she could watch the waves crash against the rocks and the gulls wheel and cry in the salt wind. It was more than she had dared hope for in 7 years. It was almost too much to bear. Her duties were vague, undefined, shifting. King Thaddeus simply wanted her near. She found herself organizing the chaos of his library, her hands reverent on scrolls that detailed tactical formations and legal precedents in the history of the coastal kingdoms. Her education, dormant for so long, stirred to life. She had been trained not just as a warrior, but as a leader taught to read and write and think critically about strategy and governance. She sat in on council meetings, a silent shadow in the corner of the great hall, watching the intricate and dangerous dance of pack politics unfold. 12 lords, 3 ladies, 2 advisors, all jockeying for position and influence, all watching each other with the wariness of predators circling prey. And afterward, in the privacy of his study, Thaddeus would ask her opinion. "What did you see that I missed?" he would say, pouring them both wine from a bottle that looked older than she was. She gave him a soldier's assessment, blunt, unvarnished, free of the sycophantic praise and careful deflection that characterized every other voice in his court. "Lord Garrison pushed hardest for the Reaver strike," she said one evening 3 weeks into her new life. "But he's your uncle, your blood. He raised you after your father died. Why would he want you to commit forces to a risky offensive?" Thaddeus looked at her sharply, something shifting behind his gaze. "You think he has ulterior motives?" "I think everyone in that room has ulterior motives," Lysa replied. "The question is which motives align with the kingdom's interests and which align only with their own." He smiled, then a real smile that transformed his harsh face into something almost gentle. "You sound like your father." He thought the same way. Saw 3 moves ahead on the board while everyone else was still studying the pieces. The mention of her father should have hurt. But somehow coming from Thaddeus, it felt like a gift. An acknowledgement that Marcus Ashcroft had been worthy of remembering even by the man who had killed him. But if her time with the king was a strange oasis of intellectual companionship and growing trust, the rest of the court was a desert of barely concealed hostility. Lady Seraphine Thornville was a master of the knife disguised as a smile. She treated Lisa with a cloying, condescending sweetness that was sharper than any blade. She would accidentally spill wine on Lisa's dress at dinner, offering profuse apologies while her obsidian eyes glittered with malice. She would praise Lisa's rustic charm in front of the assembled court, a compliment that painted her as a feral pet the king had taken in out of misplaced pity. The other nobles followed Seraphine's lead. Lysa was an outsider, a nobody, a curiosity. The king's strange fixation. They looked through her as if she were made of glass, their attention sliding past without acknowledgement. The external siege, as Lysa came to think of it, had begun in earnest. Seraphine was not attacking her directly. That would be too crude, too obvious. Instead, she was building walls around her, isolating her, using whispers and veiled insults as weapons, turning the court into a cage where Lysa was visible to all but acknowledged by none. Only with Thaddeus did the walls come down. Their time together became the axis around which her days turned. Stolen hours late at night after the court had retired, when the keep grew quiet and the only sounds were the distant crash of waves and the crackle of the fire in his study. They would sit in worn leather chairs, his great wolfhound, a beast named Ash, sleeping at their feet. He spoke of the burden of his crown, of the loneliness that was a king's constant companion, of the weight of decisions that sent men to their deaths or saved them, and how that weight never truly lifted. And he spoke of the guilt. Always the guilt. "I see their faces," he said one night, staring into his wine. "Every man who fell under my command, every civilian caught in the siege fires. I remember their names, how they died, what they said in their last moments if I was there to hear it." Looking up at her, his expression haunted. "Your father, Commander Ashcroft. He stood on that wall and he knew he was going to die. He could have retreated, saved himself. But he held that gate for 37 minutes. I counted. My beast counted every second because it was beautiful and terrible, and I hated him for making me kill him." Lysa felt something crack inside her chest. "He was doing his duty," she said quietly, "protecting his people. That's all he ever wanted to do." "I know," Thaddeus replied. "That's what makes it worse." He was right. His city was harboring raiders, yes, but he was still right to defend it. And I was right to end the threat. And we were both right, and we both have blood on our hands, and there's no way to make that balance. She found herself speaking of her own past, not as a source of grief, but as a source of strength. She told him of her training, of the discipline required to stand in a shield wall when every instinct screamed to run, of the philosophy her commanders had drilled into her, that true strength wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. She spoke of the life she had lost, the woman she had been. And for the first time in 7 years, she didn't feel like she was mourning. She felt like she was remembering, honoring. "You miss it," Thaddeus observed one night. "The purpose, the clarity of knowing your role." "I do," she admitted. "I was good at it. I knew who I was, what I was supposed to do. Everything since has been drifting, surviving but not living." He reached across the small table between them and took her hand. The gesture was becoming familiar, comfortable. His thumb traced the old scar on her palm, the one from a training accident when she was 16. "You're not drifting anymore," he said. "I see you, Lysandra. The warrior you were, the woman you still are." And in the firelight with his hand warm around hers, she believed him. But 3 weeks into this new life, the storm came. It started as a literal storm rolling in from the sea with the fury of something alive and angry. The wind howled, throwing rain against the windows and sheets. The waves rose to 30 feet, crashing against the cliffs with a sound like continuous thunder. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the keep in stark flashes of white light. Thaddeus could not sleep. Lysa heard him pacing in his study long after midnight, the steady rhythm of boots on stone broken only by the storm's fury. She rose from her bed, pulled a shawl around her shoulders, and knocked softly on the connecting door. "Come," his voice called, rough and tired. She found him standing at the window, one hand braced against the stone frame, staring out at the violence of the sea. He had changed from his formal clothes into simple trousers and a loose shirt, his feet bare on the cold floor. His hair was disheveled. "I can't," he started, then stopped. Started again. "The storm. It's in me tonight. The rage. The guilt. It comes in waves like this, and I feel myself drowning in it." Lysa crossed the room without hesitation. She placed her hands on his chest right over his heart, feeling the frantic, powerful beat of it beneath her palms. "Then let me be your anchor," she said softly. He stilled completely. His attention dropped to her hands on his chest, then rose to her face. The silver of his eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, reflecting the lightning outside. "You quiet the storm in me, Lysandra," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "You walk into my chaos and you don't flinch. You don't turn away." He lifted one hand, his calloused fingers impossibly gentle as they traced the line of her jaw. "I have been alone for so long, in my power, in my guilt, surrounded by people but utterly isolated. I think," he paused, seeming to struggle with the words, "I think I have been waiting for you my entire life." It was not a confession of love, not yet, but it was something deeper, more fundamental. Recognition. Need. The acknowledgement of two broken pieces that somehow impossibly fit together. Lisa's heart felt too large for her chest, swelling with a feeling so fierce and new, it was almost painful. Hope. It was hope, fragile and terrifying, and precious beyond measure. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice trembling. "A pull, like gravity. I don't understand it, but I feel it." He leaned down, his forehead coming to rest against hers. They stood like that for a long moment, breathing each other's air, his hands on her shoulders and hers on his chest. Two people who had been drowning separately, finding that together they could float. Neither of them noticed the faint golden glow that emanated from where her palms pressed against him, a warmth that spread through his chest, easing the tightness that had lived there for years. It faded quickly. But from the shadows of the hallway outside, a pair of obsidian eyes watched. Seraphine had seen, and she knew that the time for subtlety was over. The trap was sprung 3 days later. It involved Cassian, a small boy of about 6 years old, an orphan from the Reaver War. His parents had died 8 months ago when raiders had burned their coastal village to the ground. He was a quiet, shy child with wide gray eyes that held too much knowledge of loss for his age. Lisa had taken a liking to him almost immediately. He reminded her painfully of her little brother Liam, who had died at 10 when Ironwood fell. She would sneak him sweets from the kitchen, tell him stories of the heroes of Ironwood's history, let him trail after her as she went about her vague duties. She didn't notice that Cassian also spent time with Lady Seraphine, that the elegant noblewoman showered him with gifts and attention, filling the void left by his dead parents with pretty words and expensive toys. The day was bright and cold, one of those clear autumn afternoons when the wind off the sea carried a knife's edge. Lysa was walking with Cassian in the wind garden, a small courtyard on the eastern side of the keep, where twisted trees grew at impossible angles, shaped by decades of constant wind. She was teaching him to skip stones in the fountain, showing him how to find the flat ones, how to flick his wrist just so. He laughed when he managed 3 skips, a sound of pure childhood joy that made her heart ache. Lady Lysandra, a voice called, honey sweet and poisonous. A word, if you please. Seraphine appeared from around a hedge flanked by two guards wearing the colors of House Thornville. Her dress was a deep emerald today, cut to accentuate her figure, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken hours. Lisa straightened, instinctively moving to place herself between Seraphine and Cassian. My lady. Go play by the fountain, sweet one, Seraphine said to Cassian, her voice dripping false warmth. The grown-ups need to talk. Cassian looked up at Lysa uncertainly. She nodded, giving him what she hoped was a reassuring smile. Go on, I'll be right here. The boy scampered off his small feet, crunching on the gravel paths. Seraphine circled Lysa slowly. The king seems quite taken with you, she observed. A little washerwoman. How novel. My position is at the king's pleasure, Lysa replied, keeping her voice even. Oh, his pleasure can be redirected easily enough, Seraphine said with a dismissive wave. He has always had peculiar tastes, our dear Thaddeus. A fascination with broken things. Strays he brings in from the cold. But his fancies pass given time. She stopped directly in front of Lysa, close enough that Lysa could smell her perfume, something expensive and cloying. He has a kingdom to run, Seraphine continued, alliances to maintain, an alliance with my father, for instance. 400 warriors, control of the eastern passes, trade routes to the interior, an alliance that would be cemented by our union. There it was, the truth laid bare. Seraphine wasn't just defending her position. She was defending what she saw as her birthright. You are a complication, Seraphine said, her voice dropping to a hiss. A grubby little variable in a very important equation, and I am here to erase you. The scream tore through the air before Lysa could respond. Cassian. They both turned. The boy was lying on the ground by the fountain, clutching his left arm. Blood seeped between his small fingers, dark and terrifying against his pale skin. A small, ornate dagger lay on the stone beside him, its blade red. Lisa recognized it instantly. The monogram on the hilt, Saint Seraphine Thornville, one of Seraphine's personal blades. One of Seraphine's guards was standing over the boy, his face a mask of feigned shock. He fell, the guard shouted, his voice carrying across the garden. The woman, she pushed him. It happened so fast, Lysa's mind could barely process the choreography of the betrayal. Seraphine rushed to the boy's side, scooping him up in her arms. Cassian was crying genuine tears of pain and fear streaming down his face. My sweet boy. Seraphine crooned loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. What did she do to you? Doors burst open. Guards from the keep, alerted by the commotion, flooded into the garden. Lords and ladies drawn by the noise appeared on balconies and in doorways. An audience? Exactly what Seraphine needed. She attacked him. Seraphine shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Lysa. This savage from the ruins, she tried to kill this innocent child. She is a spy, a saboteur, here to take her revenge against the king. The accusation hung in the air. The court gasped, the sound rippling through the assembled nobles. It made a twisted kind of sense to them, Lisa realized with dawning horror. The outsider, the daughter of the conquered, the king's strange pet turning on them when the opportunity arose. Lysa stood frozen, her mind racing. The dagger was Seraphine's monogram, the guard's testimony, the bleeding child, the perfectly positioned witnesses. It was a frame elegant and vicious and utterly convincing. Her word against a highborn lady, against a loyal guard, against the evidence of a terrified child. She had no chance. King Thaddeus arrived, parting the crowd. His face was a thundercloud anger, barely contained. He took in the scene in an instant. Seraphine holding the bleeding Cassian, the dagger on the ground, Lysa standing alone, her face pale. What is the meaning of this? He roared, and the sound of it made strong men flinch. She is a traitor, your majesty, Seraphine cried, tears streaming down her perfect face. Real tears, Lysa noted distantly. The woman was truly talented. She attacked this war orphan, a symbol of the very people you seek to protect. She is using your trust to destroy you from within. Alpha Marcus Thornville stepped forward from the crowd, his presence imposing and deliberate. He was a large man, barrel-chested with iron-gray hair and cold, dark eyes that held no mercy. Your Majesty, he said, his voice grave, my alliance cannot stand while you harbor a viper in your court. The safety of our children, the integrity of your kingdom demands justice. Swift and certain. The threat was clear as crystal. Choose Lysa, lose the alliance, lose 400 warriors, risk civil war with one of the most powerful packs in the Cascade Cliffs, or condemn her, maintain the alliance, keep the peace. It was a political checkmate executed with surgical precision. Thaddeus looked at Lysa, and she saw a universe of agony in his expression. He was trapped. The king was trapped, and they both knew it. He walked to her slowly, his footsteps echoing on the stone. The crowd held its breath. When he spoke, his voice was cold, devoid of all the warmth she had come to know in their stolen hours together. You are a danger to this court. Each word was a physical blow landing with devastating accuracy. You are a child of a conquered enemy, and your presence here has brought nothing but discord. He was condemning her publicly, playing the role required of him. The triumph on Seraphine's face was blinding, vicious, and complete. You are hereby banished from the Cascade Cliffs territory, Thaddeus declared, his voice ringing with royal authority across the silent garden. You will be given a horse and enough supplies for 3 days. If you are found in my lands after that time, you will be executed on sight. He turned his back on her, didn't look at her again, didn't meet her gaze. The pain was so sharp, so absolute, it was like a physical blade twisting in her gut. Betrayal. After everything, after the connection they had built, the trust they had shared, he had believed them. He had chosen his kingdom over her. A guard grabbed her arm, his grip rough and impersonal. She didn't resist. She couldn't. She was numb, hollow, a ghost once more. As they dragged her toward the gates, she caught one last glimpse of Thaddeus's face. For a fleeting second, the mask slipped. She saw not anger, but desperate, wrenching despair. Pain that mirrored her own. And in that instant, she understood. He wasn't condemning her. He was saving her life. A trial would have been a sham, orchestrated by Seraphine and her father. It would have ended in execution. Public and brutal, a message to anyone who dared threaten the established order. He couldn't stop it. Couldn't fight the political machinery that Seraphine had set in motion. So he had done the only thing he could, thrown her out, given her a horse, supplies, a chance to live. It was the cruelest kindness she had ever known. And as they shoved her toward the stables, as the full weight of what she had lost crashed down on her, she understood something else. The villain had won. She was alone again. And this time there was no coming back. The wilderness was an unforgiving beast. The coastal wind sliced through Lysandra's thin cloak, cutting to the bone. The trees this far north were gnarled and twisted, shaped by decades of salt spray and relentless gales, offering little shelter from the elements. For 14 days she survived on skills she had thought buried with her old life. She snared rabbits using loops of wire salvaged from an abandoned farmstead. She dug for roots in the rocky soil, her fingers bleeding and numb. She followed game trails south, always south, away from the Cascade Cliffs, and the man who had cast her out to save her life. The nights were the worst. Temperatures dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that she woke shivering violently, her breath forming clouds of vapor that hung in the air. One night she nearly died. The cold crept into her bones, slowing her thoughts, making sleep seem like a warm and welcoming thing. Only the memory of her father's voice, sharp and commanding, pulled her back from the edge. On your feet, soldier. Movement is warmth. Stillness is death. She lost 18 pounds. Her clothes hung loose on her frame. Her face became gaunt, all sharp angles and shadowed hollows. But she survived. On the 15th day, she stumbled into a small trading post called Pine Creek, a cluster of rough buildings huddled against the forest where trappers and merchants passed through on their way to larger settlements. She traded the silver buckle from her belt for hot soup and information. The information broke her heart. You hear about the Alpha King, a grizzled merchant said, warming his hands by the fire. Poor bastard is dying, some kind of cold sickness the healers can't touch. Started about 2 weeks back, right after he banished that woman from Ironwood. Lysa's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. What kind of sickness? She asked, trying to keep her voice casual. They say his heart is freezing solid. The merchant continued, oblivious to her distress. He won't eat, won't speak, just lies in his chambers, getting colder and colder. Lady Thornvale is running the keep now. Word is she'll be named Queen Regent when he finally dies. The soup turned to ash in her mouth. This was no sickness. This was the poison of the soul, the same spiritual wound that had driven the beast into the Tideclaw cave. Guilt and grief made manifest. By casting her out, Thaddeus had reopened that wound. And without her there to anchor him, he was drowning in it, freezing from the inside out. Lysa set down the soup, her decision already made. She asked careful questions, learned the layout of the roads, the distance back to Cascade Keep. 3 days hard riding if she had a horse, 6 days on foot. She had neither horse nor coin to buy one. But she had something else. She had a name written in Thaddeus's letter that she still carried folded against her heart. Elias Thorne. Pinewood. 2 days south. She walked through the night. Pinewood was smaller than Pine Creek, barely 600 souls clustered around a lumber mill. She found Elias Thorne's house on the outskirts, a sturdy log structure with smoke rising from the chimney. She knocked. The man who answered was old, perhaps 68, but still powerfully built. His hair was white as fresh snow, his face weathered by years and hard living. But when his gaze fell on Lysa, it widened with recognition. Saints in stone, he breathed. You're Marcus's girl. You have his eyes. You're Elias Thorne, she said. It wasn't a question. I am. He looked past her, scanning the road. Are you alone? Yes. He grabbed her arm and pulled her inside, quickly shutting the door behind her. Good. Come. There are people you need to meet. He led her through the house to a back room, and what Lysa saw there made her breath catch. 17 people, crowded into a space meant for perhaps 8. Their faces turned toward her as she entered, and she saw in them what she saw in her own mirror every morning. Survivors, people who had learned to hide, to endure, to carry their grief in silence. People from Ironwood. We've been here 7 years, Elias said quietly. 11 civilians, 6 warriors. We got out through the northern passage while your father held the gate. A man stepped forward from the group, and Lysa's heart nearly stopped. She knew that face. Sergeant Alaric Frost, her father's second in command. A man she had seen die buried under rubble when the eastern wall collapsed. Sergeant, she whispered. Not dead, he said with a grim smile. Just very good at playing dead. It's good to see you, Lysa. Your father would be proud of what you've become. She looked around at the assembled faces, recognized some, didn't recognize others. Men and women who had been her neighbors, her comrades, her people. Why didn't you reveal yourselves, she asked. Why hide all this time? Hide from what? Elias replied. Ironwood is gone. We had no home to return to, no army to rebuild. We've been waiting, waiting for a sign, waiting for a leader. He looked at her with penetrating clarity. You're Marcus Ashcroft's daughter. You're that sign. Lysa felt the weight of their expectations settle on her shoulders. She had come here seeking help to save Thaddeus. She had not expected this. But as she looked at their faces, at the hope kindling there, she knew what she had to do. King Thaddeus Stormborn is dying, she said. Not from illness, but from guilt and grief. The woman who framed me, Lady Seraphine Thornville, orchestrated it. She and her father planned to kill the king weeks ago using poisoned reavers. When that failed, she turned her sights on me. She's consolidating power, and when Thaddeus dies, she'll rule as regent. She took a breath, steadying herself. I'm going back, not for revenge, for justice, for the man who carries the weight of Ironwood's fall every day, the man who exiled me to save my life. She looked at Alaric, then at the others. I could use my people beside me. Silence fell. Then Alaric stepped forward and placed his fist over his heart, the old salute of the Ironwood First Guard. I'm with you, he said. One by one, the other 5 warriors followed. A woman named Lena, sharp-eyed and deadly with a bow. 2 brothers, Garrick and Finn, a massive man called Stone, and a young woman barely 20 named Iris, who had been a scout. Then we have 3 days to prepare, Lysa said, because we're going to infiltrate Cascade Keep, expose the conspiracy, and save a king. They rode north with borrowed horses and stolen weapons, moving fast and quiet through terrain Lysa was learning to read. Alaric rode beside her, his presence a comfort and a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she might reclaim. Your father would have approved, he said on the second day, going back for an enemy who showed mercy. That's exactly the kind of thing Marcus would do. Thaddeus isn't my enemy, Lysa replied quietly. Not anymore. I know, Alaric said. I can see it in your expression when you speak of him. Your father saw the same thing in your mother once. That look that says, this is the person my soul recognizes. They reached the outskirts of Cascade Keep on the 3rd day as the sun was setting and storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The same kind of storm that had driven Lysa to Thaddeus' study, where she had placed her hands on his chest and promised to be his anchor. She would keep that promise, even if it killed her. We wait for full dark, she told the others. Then Alaric, Lena, Stone, and I go over the wall. The rest of you stay here with the horses. If we're not back by dawn, ride south and don't look back. The climb would have killed an ordinary person. The sea-facing wall of Cascade Keep rose 60 feet straight up from jagged rocks where the surf exploded in white fury. The stone was slick with spray and moss, treacherous, even in good conditions. In the driving rain of the storm, it was nearly suicidal. But Lena was the best archer Ironwood had ever produced. She fired a rope arrow that caught on the parapet, the line secure and taut. Lysa went first, her hands remembering the grip, the pull, the burn of rope against calloused palms. Behind her came Alaric, then Stone, then Lena. They crested the wall in silence, dropping into shadow on the other side. 2 sentries huddled against the rain, miserable and inattentive. Lysa and Alaric moved in tandem strikes delivered with precision to the base of the skull. The guards dropped without a sound. Inside the keep was transformed. The warmth and life that had characterized it during Lysa's brief time here had been replaced by something cold and fearful. The few guards they passed had haunted looks, moving through the halls like ghosts themselves. They found Captain Declan in a side corridor doing his rounds. He saw Lisa and froze his hand going to his sword. Then recognition flooded his face, followed by something that looked like hope. "I knew you'd come back," he whispered. "I told Margot you would." "Where is he?" Lisa asked. "His chambers. Seraphine has 4 guards outside. And Lisa?" Declan's face was grim. "It's bad. He's covered in frost. The temperature in the room is below freezing. The healers say if someone doesn't break through to him soon, he'll be dead by morning." "I'll break through," Lisa said with certainty. "I need a diversion, something to pull those guards away." Declan nodded. "Give me 10 minutes. I'll create enough chaos in the West Tower to pull half the keep's guard." They waited in shadow while Declan disappeared. Lisa counted her heartbeats, using them to measure time, the way she had counted drops of water in the tide claw. 500 beats, 600, 700. Then the alarm bells rang. The sound of running feet, shouts of "fire in the West Tower," guards abandoning posts, rushing toward the perceived emergency. 2 of Seraphine's guards left. 2 remained. Lena's arrows flew in near silence, tipped with a sleeping draft that Elias had provided. The guards crumpled. Lisa pushed open the door to Thaddeus's chambers and stepped into winter. The temperature hit her like a physical blow. 20 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe colder. Her breath emerged in great clouds of vapor. Ice crystals formed on the door frame, spreading across the wood like living things. And in the center of the room on the great bed lay Thaddeus. He was covered in frost. Thick crystalline layers coated his body, his hair, his eyelashes. It glittered in the dim light like diamonds, beautiful and deadly. His chest rose and fell in shallow, barely perceptible movements. His skin was pale, tinged with blue. He looked like a carving of ice and snow, a statue of a man rather than a living thing. And sitting in a chair beside the bed, a smile of cold satisfaction on her perfect face, was Lady Seraphine Thornville. She looked up as Lisa entered, and her smile widened. The little rat returns to the sinking ship. "How delightfully predictable." "Get away from him," Lisa snarled. "He is my king," Seraphine said, rising gracefully from her chair. "My future husband. It's such a tragedy, really. Our beloved king dying of a broken heart. They'll write songs about it. The lone wolf who couldn't survive without his mate." She gestured to Thaddeus's frozen form with mock sadness. "Of course, I'll mourn appropriately. And then I'll rule as queen regent for the heir that my father's bloodline will conveniently provide. The Thornvale pack has wanted Cascade Keep for generations. Now it's finally ours." 2 more guards appeared in the doorway behind Lisa, swords drawn. "Seize her," Seraphine commanded, "and this time make certain she doesn't leave the castle alive." The guards advanced, but the woman they were advancing on was not the refugee washerwoman, not the king's quiet attendant. She was Lysandra Ashcroft of the Ironwood First Guard, and she had come to fight a war. She moved. Her hand closed around the iron poker from the fireplace, its weight familiar and deadly. The first guard lunged his sword, aimed for her chest. She parried with the poker, the clang of steel on iron ringing in the frigid air, and brought the poker around in a vicious arc that connected with his temple. He dropped. The second guard was more cautious, circling her with his blade extended. They exchanged 8 moves, a deadly dance of strike and parry. He was good, trained, and experienced. But he was a palace guard accustomed to ceremony and show. Lisa was a battlefield warrior trained in the brutal efficiency of kill or be killed. She feinted left, drawing his guard that direction, then struck right. The poker caught him behind the knee, buckling his leg. As he fell, she brought it around again, catching him across the throat. Not hard enough to kill, but hard enough to ensure he wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. She turned to Seraphine, who was backing toward the door, her face pale with genuine fear for the first time. "You're not leaving," Lisa said coldly. "You're going to watch." She dropped the poker and moved to the bed. Thaddeus lay there, death's frozen embrace pulling him down into darkness. She could feel the unnatural cold radiating from him in waves, a spiritual sickness made manifest. Lisa reached out and grabbed his hand. Pain exploded up her arm. It was cold, so cold it burned searing nerve endings and turning muscle to agony. Ice against her skin, fusing to her palm. She gasped, nearly letting go. But she held on, closing her eyes, reaching deep inside herself to the place where she had felt that strange warmth in the Tideclaw cave. The golden glow that had appeared when she touched him. It wasn't a trick. It was real. It was hers. She thought of the beast in the darkness, trusting her enough to allow her touch. She thought of Thaddeus placing her hand over his heart, confessing his guilt in loneliness. She thought of the way he saw her, truly saw her, when everyone else looked through her. She thought of his absence, the ache of it, the wrongness of a world where he didn't exist. And she poured everything into her grip, her rage at the injustice, her grief at what they had lost, her stubborn, defiant love for this broken man who carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders and thought he deserved to suffer alone. "You will not die," she commanded, her voice ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. You will not leave me alone again. Something ignited in the pit of her stomach, an ember that had always been there waiting. Dormant for 24 years, sleeping in her blood, passed down through generations of Ashcroft women who had been healers and warriors both. The ember sparked, grew, became a flame, and then it became an inferno. Golden fire erupted from her hands, flowing into Thaddeus like liquid light. It was not heat in the ordinary sense. It was life itself, fierce and wild, and utterly unstoppable. It poured from her body into his, seeking out the source of the cold, the spiritual wound that was killing him. The ice on his skin began to sizzle. Steam rose in clouds as frost turned to water, water to vapor. The blue tinge of his lips receded, replaced by healthy pink. Color returned to his face. The temperature climbed steadily, 20 degrees to 30, 40, 50, each increment marked by another layer of frost melting away. Within 2 minutes, the room had warmed to 68 degrees, the ice completely vanished. The fireplace, which had been dark and cold, suddenly roared to life, flames leaping up with golden tongues that matched the light pouring from Lisa's hands. Seraphine gasped, stumbling backward. "What are you?" Lisa didn't answer. She was a conduit, a vessel for something ancient and powerful. The Soulfire Lady Margot would later explain, reading from texts 100 years old. The gift of the Ashcroft bloodline. Healers who could burn away spiritual poison, who could reach into the soul itself and mend what was broken there. But it only activated for one's true mate, only for the person the soul recognized as its other half. The golden fire flowed and flowed, burning away guilt and grief and the poison of loneliness. It found the wound that Ironwood had carved into Thaddeus' spirit, and it filled it with light, with warmth, with the promise that suffering was not the only path. Thaddeus' eyes opened, clear, sharp, silver as molten metal in the golden glow. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first true breath he had taken in 3 weeks. His hand, warm now and alive, tightened around Lisa's. "Lysandra," he breathed. And then, seeing the fading golden light on her hands, understanding flooding his features. "The guilt, the cold, it's gone. You burned it away." Tears streamed down Lisa's face. Exhaustion crashed over her, the toll of channeling such power leaving her hollowed out and trembling. But she smiled, radiant and fierce. "I told you I'd be your anchor." Thaddeus sat up, his gaze moving past her to Seraphine, who was pressed against the wall, her face a mask of terror and disbelief. The softness in his expression vanished, replaced by the cold, absolute fury of an alpha king who had been betrayed. "Guards!" he roared, and the sound shook the stones of the castle. Captain Declan and his loyal men came running. Behind them, Alaric and the other Ironwood warriors, swords drawn. "Seize Lady Seraphine Thornvale," Thaddeus commanded, his voice like cracking ice. "She is charged with treason, conspiracy to commit regicide, and the attempted murder of her king. Take her to the deepest dungeon. She will await my judgment. Also send riders to detain Alpha Marcus Thornvale at the border," he continued, "and bring Lord Garrison to me in chains. The conspiracy ends tonight." Seraphine didn't fight as the guards took her. She stared at Lysa with eyes full of hatred and fear, seeing something in her she couldn't comprehend. "You'll always be the daughter of a conquered city," she hissed as they dragged her away. "They'll never truly accept you." "She is the woman who saved my life," Thaddeus replied coldly. "That is all that matters." When the guards had taken Seraphine away and the room had emptied of all but Lysa and Thaddeus, he turned to her. The mask of kingship fell away, leaving only the man beneath. He reached up, his hand warm now, and cupped her face tenderly. His thumb brushed away her tears. "You came back," he whispered, his voice full of wonder and gratitude, and something deeper that made her heart ache. "I would always come back for you," she said, her voice breaking. He pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her with desperate strength. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in his scent, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. He was warm. He was alive. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured into her hair. "I thought the only way to save you was to send you away, and it nearly killed me." "I know," she said, "but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the room that had been a tomb and was now warm with life again. 5 days later, the great hall of Cascade Keep was packed with over 200 people, lords and ladies from every pack in the territory. Merchants and soldiers and common folk all crowded together to witness justice. The trial was held in full public view, as tradition demanded, for charges of treason against the crown. Seraphine stood in chains, her beautiful face haggard after days in the dungeons. Beside her, also in chains, stood her father, Alpha Marcus Thornvale, and Lord Garrison, Thaddeus's uncle. The evidence was presented methodically, devastatingly. Captain Declan testified about the letters he had found, correspondence between Garrison and Thornvale, plotting Thaddeus's assassination. The Reaver captain captured at the border trying to flee confessed under oath. He had been paid 5,000 gold coins by Thornvale to target the king specifically during the beach battle to make it look like an accident. Young Cassian, no longer crying and manipulated, told the truth in a clear, steady voice. Lady Seraphine had told him it was just a game, had cut his arm herself with her own blade, had promised him sweets if he cried, and said Lysa had pushed him. Lysa's throat tightened. The boy she had protected, the child she had given sweets and stories to, speaking the truth that would have saved her weeks of suffering. She wanted to go to him, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but the guards held her in place. She caught his eye across the hall and nodded once. "Thank you." He nodded back, understanding. Lady Margot testified that she had witnessed Seraphine tampering with Lysa's cup at breakfast the morning of the garden incident, taking it away to obtain fingerprints for the planted knife. Lysa gave her testimony about the conversation she had overheard in the garden, the conspiracy laid bare. And then Sergeant Alaric Frost took the stand, and the hall fell into shocked silence. "I am Alaric Frost of Ironwood," he said, his voice carrying. "I survived the siege 7 years ago. And I witnessed Lord Garrison meeting with Alpha Thornville 3 times in the weeks before Ironwood fell. They plotted the siege together. Garrison wanted to eliminate the Ashcroft line because Commander Marcus Ashcroft was beloved by the people and would have been a voice of restraint on the young king. Thornvale wanted Ironwood's strategic position and resources. He looked directly at Thaddeus. "Your uncle betrayed you long before this assassination plot, Your Majesty. He helped engineer a war so you would be consumed by guilt and easier to control." The hall erupted in shouting. Thaddeus stood and silence fell instantly. "Lord Garrison Stormborn," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of betrayal and judgment. "You are my blood. You raised me when my father died, and you used that trust to manipulate me, to drown me in guilt over a war you helped create. For treason, for the blood of Ironwood on your hands, for conspiracy to murder your king, I sentence you to death by beheading. The execution will be carried out at dawn." Garrison's face remained impassive. He didn't beg, didn't plead. He simply nodded once, accepting his fate. "Alpha Marcus Thornville, for conspiracy to commit regicide, for bribery of enemy forces, for treason against the Cascade Cliffs, I sentence you to death by hanging. The execution will be carried out at dawn." Thornvale spat at Thaddeus's feet. "You're weak," he snarled. "You always were. My daughter would have ruled better than you ever could." "Your daughter," Thaddeus said coldly, "is next." He turned to Seraphine. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Lysa saw something shift in his expression. Not forgiveness, but understanding. "Lady Seraphine Thornville," he said finally, "you were raised by a man who saw you as a political tool. You were taught that power was the only thing that mattered, that love was weakness. I cannot forgive what you did, but I can acknowledge that you are as much a victim of your father's ambition as anyone." Seraphine's eyes widened surprise, breaking through her mask of hatred. "I will not execute you," Thaddeus continued. "Instead, you are stripped of your name, your title, and all lands and holdings. You are exiled permanently from the Cascade Cliffs territory. You will be escorted to the southern border and forbidden to return on pain of death. You will live, but you will live with the consequences of your choices." It was mercy, but it was also a harsher sentence than death for a woman like Seraphine. To be nobody, to have nothing, to be cast out from power and comfort into a world that didn't care about her beauty or her birthright. She was dragged away, and her last words echoed in the hall. "This isn't over," but it was. The next morning, after the executions had been carried out swiftly and without ceremony, King Thaddeus stood before his assembled court in full regalia. Black and silver armor that caught the light, making him look like a force of nature given human form. The crown of Cascade Keep waves and wolves worked in platinum and sapphire sat upon his head. And beside him, dressed in a gown of silver-gray silk that flowed like water, stood Lysandra. 3 weeks ago, Thaddeus began, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall. "I banished an innocent woman to save her life from a conspiracy I could not yet prove. I thought I was protecting her. Instead, I nearly destroyed us both." He turned to Lisa, and the look in his gaze made her breath catch. "This woman is no traitor. She is a hero of this kingdom. She saved my life twice. Once from poison in the Tideclaw cave when she approached my beast and healed my wound when no one else could. And once from the poison of my own guilt and grief when she returned to Cascade Keep and pulled me back from death itself." He took her hand, raising it so all could see. "I present to you Lysandra Ashcroft of House Ironwood, daughter of Commander Marcus Ashcroft, who died with honor defending his people. Last of the Ironwood First Guard, bearer of the ancient Soulfire. My chosen mate, my anchor, my queen." A stunned silence fell over the hall. Then one by one people began to kneel. Lady Margot first, her aged knees hitting the stone with a thud and a fierce smile on her face. Captain Declan, his fist over his heart in salute. Alaric and the Ironwood warriors, tears streaming down their weathered faces. And then the lords and ladies who had scorned her, who had looked through her, who had seen her as nothing. They knelt before the washerwoman, the refugee, the warrior who had saved their king. The coronation ceremony followed immediately, traditional and binding. A crown was placed upon Lysa's head. Silver worked with blue sapphires, the color of the sea lighter than Thaddeus's, but no less magnificent. They spoke the ancient vows. I pledge my life, my strength, my kingdom. Thaddeus said, his voice steady and sure. I pledge my loyalty, my courage, my heart. Lysa replied, her voice ringing clear. And then in front of 200 witnesses, Thaddeus Stormborn kissed his queen. It was not a chaste political kiss. It was passionate and deep and full of all the longing and fear and relief of the past weeks. It was a promise and a claiming and a homecoming all at once. Lysa felt the weight of 200 gazes on them, nobles who had scorned her now witnessing her elevation. But in Thaddeus's arms, with his mouth on hers and his heart beating against her chest, the crowd faded to nothing. There was only this chosen claimed home. The hall erupted in cheers. 6 months later, the world looked different. Lysandra stood on the battlements of Cascade Keep, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. 5 months pregnant, the baby growing strong and healthy inside her. A girl, the healers said, though Lysa knew it in her bones already. The sea spread out before her, gray-green and endless. The wind was cool but not cold, carrying the scent of salt and spring. Below in the training yard, she could see Alaric drilling the new combined forces. Warriors from Cascade and Ironwood training side by side. The integration had not been easy. 7 years of enmity could not be erased overnight. But it was happening, slowly, carefully, built on the foundation of Thaddeus and Lysa's union. The council had been restructured. 12 original lords plus 3 new representatives from the Ironwood survivors. Alaric served as general of the combined forces. Lady Margot oversaw the treasury with a sharp eye and sharper tongue. Captain Declan commanded the King's Guard, his loyalty absolute. Laws had been passed. The Lysa Codes they were called, though she had tried to protest the name. Protections for war refugees. Paths to citizenship for displaced peoples. Restrictions on pack military forces to prevent any single family from accumulating too much power. A requirement that the council approve declarations of war with 3/4 majority, not just the king's word. And Ironwood was being rebuilt. Lysa and Thaddeus had ridden there 2 months ago through the mountain passes to the ruins of her home. The city was rising again, built with workers who were paid fair wages, not enslaved labor. The design blended Cascade architecture with Ironwood's traditional style, a physical representation of 2 peoples becoming one. In the center of the new city square stood a memorial. Black granite carved with 2,847 names, every person who had died in the siege. At the top in letters of gold were the words, Commander Marcus Ashcroft, he bought us time. Lysa had stood there for an hour, her hand on her father's name, and wept. Not from grief alone, but from gratitude. His sacrifice had meaning. His city would live again. Ironwood was now an autonomous territory within the Cascade Cliffs kingdom. Lysa ruled it as Duchess, though most day-to-day governance was handled by a council of Ironwood survivors and new settlers. Tax revenue was split 60%, staying local for rebuilding, 40% going to the kingdom. 800 people lived there now, refugees returning, families putting down roots. Life taking hold in the ashes. Small feet pattered on the stone behind her. Lysa turned to see Cassian running toward her, his face bright with excitement. He had been officially made a ward of the crown, adopted in all but name. Thaddeus was teaching him to read and write, preparing him for a future as a diplomat. Queen Lysandra, he called. The new library is finished. Come see the Ashcroft Library. Named for her grandfather, the scholar whose book Thaddeus had given her that first night. It held not just Cascade's texts, but recovered manuscripts from Ironwood knowledge preserved and honored. Lead the way, little diplomat, Lysa said, with a smile ruffling his hair. As they walked back toward the keep, Lysa saw Thaddeus waiting in the doorway. He was dressed simply today, just dark trousers and a loose shirt, his hair pulled back. He looked younger like this, the hard lines of his face softened. His gaze found hers, and the smile that crossed his face was radiant. Pure joy, uncomplicated and true. He met her halfway, his hand going immediately to her belly. How is she? Strong, Lysa said. Active. I think she's going to be a warrior. Like her mother, Thaddeus said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. And if it's a boy, Marcus, they said in unison, then laughed. That night in their private chambers, they lay together by the fire. Ash the wolfhound sprawled at the foot of the bed, snoring softly. Thaddeus's hand rested on Lysa's belly, feeling the baby kick against his palm. Boy or girl, he said quietly, they'll grow up in a better world than either of us knew. No guilt, no shame, just possibility. Lysa placed her hand over his. We're building that world, together. You taught me how to live with my scars, Thaddeus said, turning to look at her. The guilt doesn't own me anymore. It's part of my history, but it's not my whole story. You gave me a home, Lisa replied. A name, a purpose. You saw me when I was invisible. They felt silent content in each other's presence. Through the window, the sea stretched endless and eternal. The waves crashed against the rocks, the sound a constant rhythm that had outlasted kingdoms and would outlast them too. But for now, in this moment, they were enough. Two broken pieces that had found a way to fit together. A washerwoman and a king, a conqueror and the daughter of the conquered, a beast and the woman who had calmed it with nothing but compassion and courage. They had built something new from the ashes, a kingdom, a family, a love that had been forged in blood and fire and had emerged stronger for it. Lysa closed her eyes, Thaddeus's warmth beside her, their child growing beneath her heart, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt complete. She was Lysandra Ashcroft Stormborn, last of the Ironwood First Guard, Queen of Cascade Cliffs, Duchess of Ironwood, bearer of the soul fire, the anchor who had saved a king, and she was home.